Hello, everyone. I think that we're going to go ahead and get started as it's 2 minutes after the hour. Welcome. So thank you again for joining us this morning or this afternoon, as the case may be. This is our fourth and last webinar in a 4-part series that we here at FHI and with the help of INEE have been hosting over the past month. And so this webinar series is titled The 4 W's of Education in Emergencies Data. Who has what data, where can I find it, and why is this so complicated? And I know that some of you have been joining us for the past month, but for those of you who haven't, I'll just quickly give an overview of the past 3 webinars. And so the first webinar was focused on an overview of the EiE data landscape and the fragmentation in it. And the second webinar was an in-depth dive into education development data and sources. The third one focused on humanitarian and humanitarian operations data and portals. And then this last one, our fourth one, is going to focus on what we're calling contextual data, which is essentially data that helps you understand the context in which EiE is occurring, including population movement data and data on conflict occurrence. And so all of these webinars have been recorded and they are all posted on the INEE website. They're already there. So thanks again to INEE for facilitating that. And if you've missed any of them, you're welcome to check them out on the INEE site. And so I think that before we go any further, we'll just jump into the housekeeping of this webinar. So the first, we just want to make sure, I think that, yes, almost all of you have muted your microphones, and so please make sure to mute your mic and turn off your video to minimize any background noise and also save bandwidth. And then we want to mention that we will be taking questions at the end, and so you can post questions in the chat area at any time, and we'll respond to them. We're collecting them in a document, but we're not going to be responding as we go along. We're collecting them for the end. But yes, feel free to post them in the chat. And then the last thing I want to mention is that this webinar is being recorded, and that's so that we can share it with the INEE community afterwards. And so the presentation will be shared shortly after on INEE's site. And so that's about it for housekeeping. And so now I'll jump into this fourth webinar. And so we're calling this fourth session Navigating Population Movement and Conflict Data for EiE. And so before we begin, I'll introduce myself. My name is Elizabeth Buckner, and I'm an assistant professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, which is at the University of Toronto. And so hello from Toronto. And for about the past year and a half, I have been working with the MEERS team as a consultant. And then I will also allow my colleague Sean, who's in DC, to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Elizabeth. I'm Sean Kremen. I'm a research analyst at FHI 360 as part of the research and evaluation team here. Like Elizabeth, I've been working as part of the MEERS team here at FHI for the last year and a half or so. And I also support some other EiE projects and M&E here at FHI 360.
Great, thanks. And you guys will be hearing a lot more from Sean. He's leading most of the webinar afterwards. This session today is going to focus on these 2 areas. One is population data and population movement, and one is conflict. And so I'll just go through our agenda really quickly. So we've mentioned MEERS. So at the very beginning, for those of you who are new, I will introduce the MEERS project, which stands for Middle East Education Research Training and Support Project. And then we will jump into discussing what we mean by what we're calling contextual data in EiE, and specifically that focuses on what is population movement and forced displacement data in an in EIE context, and then who has it and where can I find it. And we'll point you to a number of, Sean will be pointing you to the specific resources, and then thinking about how it can be useful and what it can be used for your work. And then we will do the same for the second set of data resources, which is really like, what is conflict data, where is it, who has it, and how can it be useful for your work in EIE. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. So I think we'll, yes, move on. Great. So first, let me give you a brief introduction to MEERS. So MEERS stands for the Middle East Education, Research, Training, and Support Project. It is a 4-year project that's funded by USAID's Middle East Bureau, and it's being implemented by Social Impact is the prime, and FHI 360 is the sub. And our overall objective is to support the continuous data collection, research, training, and analysis related to education, including learners, teachers, education systems, and outcomes in the Middle East specifically. And we're focusing on 3 regions that have been, 3 parts of the region that have been affected by conflict. And so task 1 of MEERS, which is the part that FHI is really helping lead, is to support the continuous data collection on education in the crisis context of Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and their associated refugee contexts. And so for almost 2 years now, we've been looking at how we can support data in these 3 very different conflict-affected regions. And so I'll just briefly touch on what we have been doing over the past year and where this webinar series fits in. And so we started the MEERS project with really data mapping. And so in this EIE data mapping, we were asking what data is publicly available. We started out thinking, okay, what data is just available, quickly to realize that we needed to, especially for the profession and the field, we need to focus on what's publicly available and related to these 3 different crisis conflicts. And what we found is that there actually is a lot of data out there. There's a lot of resources. And so that's partly what this series comes out of, is trying to make those resources more accessible and navigable for EIE professionals. And then the second part of this, of our process, has really been doing a series of stakeholder consultations. And so we've done conversations and consultations with many different actors at the global level and those working in the Middle Eastern region, including UN agencies, the multilateral, bilateral implementing partners, the cluster system, US government actors, including USAID missions. And then we also did consultations at INEE in Oslo and others in Amman. And the goal of all of that was really to understand what data our stakeholders are collecting, using, needing, and what the big data gaps are. And we're actually now in a second round of stakeholder consultations for that. And so some of you may have already participated or be participating now in that second wave of that. And we've also, what we found through these consultations is really that there is a lot going on and a lot happening. There's a lot of very strategic initiatives that are happening at high levels among different partners to address gaps, but that we're often not coordinating. And so the next round that was doing these strategic meetings to know about other initiatives. And then really all of that leads into thinking about what is our role, how can we facilitate collaboration and coordination and whatnot to support improved accessibility, quality, and navigability of EIE data. And so this webinar series really comes out of that long process of thinking that actually we've heard there's a lot of data out there, and partly what we need is helping the field understand how to access that. And so this comes out of previous trainings that we've done at CIS in San Francisco, as well as a recent data summit that we held in Geneva in partnership with INEE and NORAG. And that data summit really brought together a number of different stakeholders to really brainstorm and lay out an agenda. And so we just want you to know that the outcomes of that action agenda are in development now, and for those of you who were there, and that that will be coming out in September, I think. It will be made public. And so we can move on. Yes, and so this webinar really fits in with that. And so this, the topic that we're addressing today is what is contextual data? And we think of contextual data, which calling it that is really data that helps us better understand the context, because our first main topic was on education development data in that second category, which really focused on UNESCO and the World Bank and EPDC and essentially in development contexts. And then the next one that we led was on humanitarian response plans and operations data, which really, both of those, I think that you would think of the topic of that data is education. And what's different is that the resources that we're addressing today are not education. You're not going to get any education indicators, no indicators of teachers or students or learners. Instead, the data is going to focus on sort of population, migration, displacement rates, as well as understanding the context of the conflict itself. And so it's that we've highlighted that last box there at the bottom of where we can get some of this data. And now I think we can move on in the slides, and I will turn it over to my colleague Sean, who's going to delve in depth into this.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that overview. So first, what we'll talk about when we dive into these sources is population movement and forced displacement data. So we'll start with just a brief overview of what we mean when we're talking about that. So just very simply, when we're talking about population movement data, it's essentially data that tracks the migration and location of people. And the forced displacement part of that comes in when we're talking about populations that were forcibly moved from their population. So for EiE context, key indicators would include number of refugees, number of IDPs, and number of returnees. So essentially information about these displaced populations. So what I will mention is that some of these sources that we'll talk about do occasionally contain information on the needs and the availability of resources for these displaced populations. And why this is important is because sometimes these indicators may be related to education, although education is not the main focus of these data sources, and we'll show an example of that or talk about that a little bit later when we delve into the sources. And so now, why are we talking about population movement data in EiE? Why is it relevant to education emergencies? So first, it really helps us to understand where people are. In some of the previous webinars, we talked a lot about the differences between humanitarian settings and more development settings. And one of the main differences is the movement of the population. So we think of more traditional development settings as having more stable populations, not as much movement in short periods of time. And in humanitarian settings, there could be weekly or daily movement of populations, which makes it much more difficult to track and means that there's more frequent data collection. So this helps us to understand where people are, maybe in areas of high influx areas where there's now a high number of IDPs, for example, in a host community that didn't previously have IDPs. It helps us to understand how many people may be going to areas that are difficult to access with resources as part of a humanitarian response. Some of these sources do have, as I mentioned, educational indicators, although they're not very many. So these could help us identify the educational needs of a population. Some of these sources help us to allocate or advocate for more educational resources in specific locations. So where we know there's more people in need or more displaced persons, we can use this data, this information, to advocate for more resources in those locations. Also, and this is sort of speaking from some of our experience in other projects at FHI 360, having some of this more contextual data and secondary population movement data sources can help inform where a rapid education response may be needed. as part of a project. Great. So now that we've had a little bit of an overview of what we're talking about when we mean population movement and forced displacement data, we're going to answer the question, who has this data and where can we find it? So this is a pretty dense table, but it's just for your reference. Maybe you can look more in depth later when these are posted on INEE's website. Just to quickly walk through some of the main sources we'll be looking at with this population movement data include UNHCR, Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, or IDMC, which focuses more on internally displaced persons, and the International Organization for Migration's Displacement Tracking Matrix, or DTM, which also focuses mainly on internally displaced persons. And we'll briefly discuss how other clusters, as part of humanitarian response, also have population movement data, namely the Camp Coordination and Camp Management cluster, which produces monthly dashboards similar to the education cluster as part of the response. So as part of UNHCR, we'll look at UNHCR PopStats, or Population Statistics Reference Database, which is an online database that contains demographic information on UNHCR's term populations of concern. We'll also briefly look at UNHCR's Global Focus, which is more of a reporting portal for donors and partners that provides high-level overviews of refugee responses. Last webinar, we discussed UNHCR's operational data portal more in depth. So we'll briefly discuss it, but if you want more materials on UNHCR's operational data portal, I would recommend looking at last week's webinar on humanitarian operations education data, where there's, I think, 7 or 8 slides dedicated to UNHCR's operational data portal. Just to provide an overview of IDMC, it monitors internal displacement and houses an online database called the Global Internal Displacement Database, or GIDD, that contains various data tools and also provides analysis on IDP situations. IOM-DTM tracks population mobility and internal displacement and also houses an online database that has not only data sets, but also reports on the different rounds of DTM data collection. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the CCHCM cluster coordinates and manages support for displaced populations in communal settings. So this could include populations in camps, informal settlements, or collective centers. And the frequency and scale on the right-hand side of the table, UNHCR PopStats is national level data that ranges from 1951 to 2018. And Global Focus has more recent data from recent refugee responses on the national level. The operational data portal, as discussed last week, contains numerous sources for these different refugee responses and has national and subnational level data, and their tools and resources and data are produced depending on the context, may vary, but they're usually updated monthly. And IDMC, as more of this large database, has national level data that's updated annually. IOM-DTM has national and subnational data that is updated more frequently. So I put quarterly here, but there are also weekly reports that come out that we'll discuss more when we talk about the DTM resources. And similarly to the education cluster, CCCM cluster has national and subnational level data with dashboards that are produced monthly. So first we'll delve into the UNHCR resources. The first being UNHCR's Population Statistics, or PopStats, which is a browser for viewing and downloading data on populations of concern and different aspects of these populations, including their location or status, so whether they're seeking asylum or refugees, etc. Some key indicators on PopStats include number of refugees, number of IDPs, number of returned refugees or IDPs, asylum seekers, and these are all by status determination. Some pros of using PopStats is that it's a broad, wide-ranging data set that has data comparable by country, and you can also use that tool to produce time series data sets that can be exported into a CSV format or on Excel. So it's good because it provides a high-level picture at the national or provincial level in some cases, but if you need more granular data, this may not be the proper data set or database. It doesn't really have data visualizations besides on the home page, and the disaggregations by sex and age are only available under one of the specific tabs, and not all the data is disaggregated by individual age group. So we'll have an activity on using PopStats in a second, but before that, we'll talk a little bit more about Global Focus, which is UNHCR's main operational reporting portal for donors and key partners that provides an overview of populations of concern and funding information on refugee responses. So this provides a global snapshot of UNHCR activities, which can be very helpful, and it's organized by refugee response situation. So you can look at, if you're interested in one particular response, such as the Syria response, you can go to that page and find a lot of information on that response. And so it shows progress towards targets for key education indicators on the global level, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we look more closely at Global Focus. However, that means since it's these global level indicators, they're limited. There's not really downloadable data. It's more of an online platform resource, not really a database, or it doesn't really have data sets, and there's no subnational data. And then UNHCR's operational data portal, which is a main source of this refugee response data, which has a lot of education resources, as we discussed last week, is available on that website, and you can hear and learn more about it by looking at last week's webinar. So jumping into an activity that you can just follow along with, or if you'd like, you can go to UNHCR PopStats online and look for yourself. Just for the purposes of making the webinar run more smoothly, we'll just walk through this. I'll walk through it, and then maybe you can look at it later. So great. So for this activity, we're going to use UNHCR PopStats to identify how many Syrian refugees were in neighboring countries like Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, and Egypt from 2016 to 2018, which we just arbitrarily picked. So essentially, after you click on the different tabs at the top, you can click on the Persons of Concern tab, which takes you to this database. It looks like this, with filterable categories on the left-hand side. So if we're looking for the years 2016 to 2018, we'll click on those. The country of asylum would be the neighboring country, so Jordan and Lebanon, for example. The country of origin would be Syria, and the types of populations we're interested in for this particular question would be refugees. So at the bottom left, we'd select refugees. I know this is hard to see, but when we make this available on INEE's website, it will be easier to see, and you would be able to zoom into these slides. And so what happens when you filter all of those categories is that it presents you with this data set that you can see right there online on your screen, but you can also export into a CSV format, which would be really nice for analysis, or if you have a much bigger data set where you're looking at maybe global numbers of refugees, so you're looking at all countries, in which case it would be much bigger. So we can see that in 2018, Turkey has over 3.6 million refugees, and then we can see also for the different countries from 2016 to 2018. So this is just one brief example on how we can use UNHCR's PopStats. So we don't have an activity associated with UNHCR's Global Focus, since it's not really a main database or has multiple data sets. But this is what it looks like. You can see different tabs on the top, such as populations, situations, operations, themes, financials, and publications. you can explore those ones. So what we've done is just taken a brief shot of some of the different types of information you can see in the populations tab, for example. So it shows a chart of different population trends over time, over time. So you have, refugee numbers, asylum seekers, IDPs, and it provides a nice visual. And then again, as I touched on briefly earlier, is if you look at the visual on the bottom right, under the Themes tab, it is tracking education, global performance targets and results for UNHCR for the education sector for 2018. So we can see a global indicator that's being tracked in all of these dots in all of these different situations. So, for example, one of them is number of children enrolled in primary education. We can see the target was 2.1 million. And at the end of 2018, the result was 1.6 million when all of the situation data was aggregated at the global level. Great. So now that we've talked about UNHCR, we'll talk a little bit more about internal displacement data. So a main source of internal displacement data is IDMC, or the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. So this is the main source of data and analysis on global internal displacement. It provides verified multi-sourced estimates of the number of people internally displaced or at risk of becoming internally displaced. And it has total number of IDPs by country, number of new displacements due to conflict, and also number of new internal displacements due to natural disasters. So it's nice to see in some countries where there may be a conflict and a certain amount of IDPs due to that conflict. We can also see if there's also a natural disaster in that same country or that same context, we can see how many new IDPs were as a result of that natural disaster. So IDMC provides a lot of really helpful tools and resources, the first being the Global Internal Displacement Database, which is an interactive platform that users can explore data and create their own visuals or download data sets that contains indicators like number of IDPs by country and number of new IDPs caused by conflict or disaster. It also has a really nice displacement data exploration tool, which allows users to generate their own custom visuals that actually puts together IDMC, UNHCR, and World Bank data to explore displacement over time and in relation to other phenomena. They provide really helpful country profiles that have overviews of key figures for a certain context and provide some analysis of internal displacement by country, so looking at maybe some drivers or impacts of displacement. And they include snapshots of key estimates and overviews of causes, patterns, and needs that come out of displacement. Finally, they have a global report that's produced every year. So this report synthesizes the most recent statistics of internal displacements caused by conflict and disaster. So these links will all be available when we provide this material, these slides after. So IDMC is nice because it has easily downloadable data sets in Excel format. They're comparable across countries. It provides visualizations as well as providing tools to create custom visuals, and they complement their data set with research and analysis into drivers, patterns, and impacts of internal displacement. However, it's mainly national level data, so it's not really granular. There's no disaggregations by gender or age. The visualization tools may be a bit difficult to use for the first time or for a non-specialist user, but with that being said, IDMC does have some videos embedded on their website that have quick trainings on how to use their tools, which is really a nice feature. So for a quick example or activity of using IDMC, something that you may do is use the GIDD, or Global Internal Displacement Database, to identify how many IDPs were in Iraq in 2018 and to find out how many new displacement occurred due to conflict and natural disaster. So on this is the main homepage of IDMC. And so what you could do is click the Displacement Data tab, which will take you to this page that has the GIDD, and it shows you this nice table, but underneath the table, you can just download exactly what is in this table into an Excel spreadsheet. So once you click download the full data set, here on the left-hand side, we see a screenshot of the first 33 rows of the full data set, and we can see that each row has the country, the year, and then the number of IDPs, the total number of IDPs, which is column D, and then column E has number of IDPs due to conflict, number of new IDPs due to conflict, and then column F has number of new IDPs due to disaster. I know it's a little hard to see because of how it's formatted, but once you download this data set for yourself and explore, you'll be able to see these indicator headings more clearly. And what we did to answer this question, or as part of this activity, was we just filtered by country name, by year, and we're able to see that the stock number of IDPs is about 1.6 million. The number of new IDPs due to conflict in 2018 was about 150,000, and the number of IDPs, new IDPs in 2018 due to natural disaster was about 69,000. Great. So now we'll talk about another source of mainly IDP data, which is the IOM, or International Organization for Migration's Displacement Tracking Matrix, or DTM. The website is provided there. DTM is a system that tracks and monitors displacement and population mobility. It provides information on needs of displaced populations, movements, and sometimes available resources depending on the emergency situation. Some key indicators that you can find on DTM, either in the reports or in the data sets, are number of IDPs and number of IDP families by location. Sometimes you can see number of IDPs by shelter type, so whether they're renting a formal housing house, whether they're in an informal camp, shelter, etc. And you can also see IDP populations by the length of their displacement in some of these data sets, depending on the context. A lot of this data is also, similar data is available for returnees, so return populations that are now back in their area of origin. And you can see that the caveat for the last key illustrative indicator on education needs and resources, it really depends on the context. But sometimes in these DTM data sets, there are indicators like binary indicators that are like, does this setting have education provision, which is a pretty broad indicator, but at least provides some insight into if there's even education being provided in a specific location in an IDP camp, for example. So sometimes that type of education information is available. Some key tools and resources from IOM's DTM is the displacement data portal. So we'll have an activity where we dive into that. This is an online platform that contains reports, data sets, and data visualizations to better understand internal displacement monitored through the DTM. Some key data sets that you can find depending on the context include baseline assessment data sets that contain data on like the population, the IDP population. So a lot of what's under the illustrative indicators and data types under that first checkpoint. The location and site assessment data sets are pretty similar. Essentially, the difference is location may include, it's more of talking about host communities or like districts or towns, and sites are more focused on IDP camps or informal settlements, for example. But they have very similar types of information in these data sets. A new resource that we just found actually when we were putting together the updated materials for this training is a flow monitoring portal, which is an online platform that contains migration flow information products, including reports, data sets, and data visualizations that show more of the mobility of populations And as of right now, I think this is mainly for Europe and West and Central Africa. So sort of outside of the scope of our Middle East focus for this webinar, but feel free to explore for yourself on the link provided. Some pros of DTM include that it's frequently updated. So as we talked about a little bit earlier, in some of these emergency contexts where people are moving weekly, daily, monthly, it's important to have updated data. So DTM provides that more frequently updated data, maybe compared to IDMC, that is a more broad and global database that is updated more on an annual basis. It contains not only data sets, but also reports, and it links, some of the reports link to the data sets, which is really nice to see for yourself what data is being used in those reports. So as opposed to just publishing reports, you're able to see the actual data that goes into them. They provide some visualizations at the global level. They have information on IDPs by location or site. As I mentioned, they occasionally provide information on education needs and resources. And they also have these, typically have bi-weekly or weekly update reports that don't necessarily have the data with them, but if you're implementing a program, sometimes these reports are really helpful to see from week to week where populations are moving. Unfortunately, it typically does not provide disaggregations of this data by gender or age. And over time, you may see quarterly reports, but then there might be gaps due to maybe the conflict becoming too hot, or the reports just may be inconsistent. So now with a quick activity for IOM DTM, this is the home page, and if you click the Displacement Data Portal tab, it will take you to that. And for this activity, we're going to identify which Yemen government has the highest number of IDPs according to the most recent round of DTM data collection. So after navigating to the Displacement Data Portal, you can see on the bottom, there are different tabs where you can find the reports, which you can filter in more of like a resource, publications library kind of. You can go to the data sets where you can filter through Excel spreadsheets. There's a data visualization tab, and etc. Or you can just click on the country on the blue or green dot over the country. And you can also see in the top left-hand corner, it has global numbers of IDPs. The top number is according to IOM's DTM, and the bottom number is according to IDMC. So it's nice to see that comparison. Great, so once we click data sets, we can filter all of the data sets by country, operation, and so if we filter this by country and choose Yemen, we can find the most recent overall broader data set from the DTM round of data collection. So this is round 37, produced in March 2019. We can click on it, and we can see in that spreadsheet the government with the highest number of IDPs, which is, in this case, Marib, and it has an estimated total of 128,000 IDP households, and if it calculates to about 6 persons per household, that's over 770,000 IDPs. So that would help us answer a question like that. And just a quick plug for another resource by IOM. They have the IOM's Global Migration Data Analysis Center, or GMDAC, Migration Data Portal. This is a platform that brings together comprehensive migration statistics from multiple sources, including UNHCR, UNDESA, and IDMC. So this is a really helpful resource for bringing together all of these different sources. And I think after just reading more about this resource, it seems like this is where, similarly to maybe like a UNESCO UIS or EPDC, it's where a lot of this data is going to be aggregated. So this is just something that could be an extremely helpful resource. So please feel free to explore for yourself and click the link once we provide the materials. It's a really interesting source of information. And just really quickly, so if we're using population movement data from other clusters to inform the response, we may look at a dashboard like this. It's an example of a CCCM dashboard from humanitarianresponse.info from Iraq 2018, February 2018. So we can see we have total number of IDPs and camps by location. We have a nice map of where the different camps are. So this is the type of information that we can get from other clusters. Great. And now we're going to look at uses of population movement data in EiE. So these are, again, just illustrative uses. It's not an exhaustive list. But for example, we can use it to identify populations of concern at national levels. So we want to know, number of IDPs or refugees by country. And we can use UNHCR PopStats or IDMC to find these numbers. We can also use it to identify reasons for displacement in population, so whether it's due to conflict or natural disaster. So we actually can see that on IDMC and IOM-DTM. We can use it to identify the amount of IDPs or returnees by location. That is for IOM-DTM. We can also use it to identify educational needs or resources in IDP camps or host communities or areas of return. And this is also found on occasionally on IOM-DTM depending on the context. So this is just a framework that we've developed to help practitioners and researchers start to identify ways in which these types of information sources can be used for their own work. Great. So now we're going to be talking more about conflict data in an EiE context. So just to provide a quick overview of what we're talking about when we mean conflict data, this is information on conflict, including events of conflict, types of conflict, actors involved, locations, dates, number of fatalities, etc. So a lot of these are the key indicators that we would use in EiE, but as well as some of these sources have specific number of attacks on schools or students or education personnel, which can be extremely helpful in a conflict context and looking at education response. So why is this data relevant to EiE? So we can use this data to better understand the conflict context and how it may impact the education sector. So this would be really helpful for a situation analysis or context analysis. We used this sort of data when doing a rapid education risk analysis, or RERA, as part of a USAID funded project, which is now mandatory as part of EiE projects funded by USAID. So a lot of this is really helpful for more understanding the context. Again, it's helpful to understand the volatility of the conflict. So if we see a high number of conflict events happening in the same place over time, we know that the conflict is more volatile there, which can be helpful for programming. We can use it to identify areas at risk for attacks on education and to advocate for more educational resources in specific locations. So who has this type of data and where can we find it? So UCDP is a broad source online database that contains information on war, civil unrest, and organized violence. It's mainly used in academic settings, but it may be helpful for just like a quick overview of a conflict context or to get high-level numbers. We won't go in depth into UCDP, but feel free to explore on your own. We will talk more about the ACLID project, which collects and maps and analyzes data on conflict and has an online database that contains information on conflict events that's updated more frequently. It has national and subnational level data. And then a unique source to both conflict and education is the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, or GCIPEA. And if you're not familiar with them, we really hope you become familiar with GCIPEA. They're doing some great work on monitoring and reporting attacks on education in the form of reports. So we'll talk a little bit more about GCIPEA's reports later. And for the Middle East context, there's also some context-specific sources, including the Yemen Data Project that has data sets, for example, on aerial bombardment in different regions in Yemen, and the Syria Partner Network, which has sources of conflict data. And I think at one point was working in partnership with ACLED. So just to provide an overview of ACLED, it's a disaggregated conflict collection analysis and crisis mapping project that provides information on types of violence, actors involved, dates, locations, and fatalities, as well as analysis on conflict patterns and impact. So some key indicators may be the number of conflict events, locations, dates, actors involved, numbers of fatalities. They have a few key tools, including the data export tool, which is where you can customize your own downloadable data, as well as being able to customize your own download. They have already curated data files that you can easily download. So for example, they have data sets that are curated by region. So if you're just interested in the Middle East region, you can download their curated data on the Middle East, which just includes the countries in that region. So it's a nice resource if you're trying to just find a one-stop shop for data. They also have a nice data dashboard that is an interactive visualization that contains crisis profiles, key figures, and a couple visuals, including a map of conflict events by location and a graph of conflict events and fatalities over time. So a nice thing about ACLED is that it's, again, a wide-ranging and broad conflict data set that provides subnational level data that's comparable across regions and countries. They have some nice visuals, and they also complement their data with research into drivers, patterns, and impacts of conflict. Some cons are that the data may be difficult to analyze for non-specialist users. It may not be that useful for rapid response as it's updated about monthly. So if you need, in humanitarian settings, a lot of times security information is needed almost daily. So this may not be the proper source for that. For our concern for the Middle East, as part of the MEERS project, data is only available from 2015 to present, and we know that these conflicts have been going on for longer than that. And at times it could be difficult. There's no specific column that says this is a school-related conflict event, so it would be more like filtering by keyword search or having to really swim through the data to figure out which of the conflict events are related to school. So here's ACLED's website. If you want to go to the data, you can just click the data tab at the top. You can use the export tool if we're trying to answer the question, or just trying to download data, conflict data for Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. We can filter by Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, other country, and export that data. And we have a nice data set with all the conflict events that have happened from 2015 onward, updated as of July 27th, so pretty recently, 2019. Here's a screenshot of the dashboard. We can see it has, for Yemen, we see it has a crisis profile, some key figures, and the two visuals at the bottom. And now for the final source we'll be talking about in this webinar, GCPEA, or GCPEA, the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, is an organization that provides resources that highlight the incidence and impact of attacks on education and conflict and security settings. It has resources that include country-specific reports and briefing papers on the impact of attacks on education, advocacy documents, and materials related to the Safe Schools Declaration endorsements. And so what we're mainly going to be looking at is the Education Under Attack reports, namely the 2018 report, which is the most recent one, that explores the impact of attacks on education in multiple countries, including information on attacks on schools, students, education personnel, military use of education facilities, child recruitment at school, and sexual violence at school, as well as attacks on higher education. So this is a key source of information for attacks on education, and the resource library includes other reports and documents that can be really helpful to provide contextual information if you're working in an EIE context. And they have country-specific profiles included as part of their Education Under TAC 2018 report, which we'll jump into now. So if we're looking for Syria country profile on attacks on education, we can either click the top tab on the Education Under Attack report, or on the bottom left, the Education Under Attack 2018 report. It takes us to a really nice virtual version of the report that we can read the profiles, which will take us to country profiles. And we can click on Syria, and here we find the Syria country profile. And sorry for speeding through this last example. Please feel free to take more time to look at it once we provide these slides. But just for the sake of time and to get to questions, we just want to make sure there's enough time. Finally, a really nice tool that's been produced in partnership with Education Above All, Humanitarian Data Exchange, or HDX, GSIPIA and Security Insight and Recoded, is the Education and Conflict Monitoring tool, which has an interactive data visualization that shows the severity of attacks on education by country, which is what's shown on the top right. And also included on this resource are 3 data sets that take numbers from the Education Under Attack 2018 report and put them into downloadable data sets, which is a really nice feature. And so this is just another, we talked about another example of HDX partnering with us in the last webinar to produce these nice data visuals and data sets. So this is just another example of what HDX is doing and trying to aggregate more education data sets from a variety of sources and put them in one spot. So feel free to click on the link to the Education and Conflict Monitor once we provide these slides. So lastly, we'll just look at 2 really quick examples of how we can use conflict data in EiE. The first would be to identify locations of conflict events, in which case we could use ACLID. And if we want to understand more about the relationship between conflict and attacks on education, and to identify the amount and types of attacks on education, we can look at GSIPIA's Education Under Attack profiles, which I think there's going to be, if I'm not mistaken, an updated report made available, I believe, in 2020. Great. So thank you so much for not only your participation in this one, and to those of you who have participated in all 4. I think we'll delve into questions, which I see there are a few. So the first question that I see is, where exactly can we find data on education in IOM's DTM? So to answer that question, it's not like it's in its own specific data set. It would depend on the country or the context example that you're looking at. So for example, I know in Northeast Nigeria, their data set that has data on IDPs and returnee population also has information on camps and informal settings and other sites. And there's indicators such as, does the site have education provision? And it would be yes or no. So it's not that in-depth piece of an education information, but that's an example of what you can find. There's also, for Northeast Nigeria at least, they will ask what resources, or what is your priority need to these, they'll ask that question to the populations. And you can see how many of these populations respond with education as the highest need. So you'd be able to find that specifically in the reports that are produced, depending on the country that you're interested in, or at times in the Excel spreadsheets that may have like a binary indicator on education.
Yeah, Sean, I'll just jump in really quickly too. So if you're on the IOM DTM, then you click on data sets, and like Sean said, it's very much you sort of have to search by the country or operation. But for example, the one from South Sudan under like it's listed as a site assessment, and so yes, navigability is a major issue. There are mainly Excel sheets that you have to download as public data sets. But for example, I was just looking to respond to your question, and South Sudan's round 5 site assessment actually has a number of questions related to education, such as does this site have access to primary education? What type? Is it a formal or a temporary learning space? The distance to the educational site, and whether there is like the provision of learning supplies, are teachers available, etc. And so obviously this will definitely depend on the site and the availability of the data there, but it might be if you're lucky, I would say, then the site that you're working in might have this level of detailed assessment.
Yeah, and another quick note that I'll just add is that as part of the data summit, we not only talked, part of the discussion was actually with IDMC, so not IOM-DTM in this case, but IDMC, about including potential education modules in their data collection to have more indicators on education. And I know this has been a conversation as well with IOM-DTM and including even more education indicators. So it's definitely an area in which we could, as part of the MEERS project and all of us collectively in the EiE community can, have these conversations with IOM-DTM to include more of these educational focused indicators in the DTM data collection rounds. So, and now I'm seeing a question from Amelie. I am wondering if you know any data set available that identifies in a displacement site who are the newcomers who were counted in the previous round of data collection. So the only thing I can think of for this, it's not necessarily a data set, but on IOM-DTM, there are what they call, and it can change depending on the context, but for the ones that I know of, they're called Emergency Tracking Tool reports, or ETT reports. And these are produced sometimes on a weekly or bi-weekly basis that show the number of, like newcomers or new or IDPs who have moved to a new location, from like June 1st to June 7th. So like this more, it's not the stock numbers, it's who has moved in the last week. I haven't seen any of these at like the specific site level. It's more of like at the district level. So it'll be like, there's 1,000 new IDPs in this particular district, which is up from, only 100 who moved here like last week. So it could help show, where it's more of like a volatile context and where there's more movement. So I would recommend that. And I would also note that we're, again, for this Nigeria example, actually in discussion with IOM-DTM about if there are data sets that go along with these ETT reports, because that would be really helpful in having that data as opposed to scraping it from these reports to have it in a data set, similarly to the like more quarterly or monthly rounds of DTM where they do produce data sets. I don't know if Elizabeth, you have anything to add.
Yeah, just really quickly, it definitely depends on what you mean by new in your, because the IDMCs, just from their very basic homepage on Global Internal Displacement Database, if you're looking at internal displacement, has these numbers essentially at the annual level. But so they say the country and the total number of IDPs, for example, as of December 31st, 2018, and then they say new displacements as a result of conflict and new displacements as a result of disasters, essentially in 2018. So that is very delayed for many people's timelines. But if you're interested in annual data on internal displacement, they do disaggregate in that way, and that might be useful too.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. I think that is it for questions for now. You have our contact information there, so feel free to reach out with any questions at any time. We'd be happy to help. And just an overall thank you to INEE for helping us host this these webinar series. We really appreciate it. and for hosting all the materials afterwards. So thanks so much for your logistical help. It's been really appreciated by the MEERS team. And we appreciate all of our participants tuning in and participating throughout the last month. It's been really exciting to see this all come together.
Yeah, thank you all so much for joining. And I'll just add that if you want to, that we're always looking for, more suggestions and opportunities. So feel free to reach out anytime.